Well, hey, welcome to week 2 of our BSM pod groups for fall semester of 2020. Um, so this week we're going to actually get into these questions. Last week was more of introduction to spiritual health. I hope your conversations were good and talking through those things and getting to know people you might not have met before. So this week the question we're going to dive into is, do you enjoy God above all else? So last week we introduced this idea of spiritual health. What is it? Why should I even care about spiritual health? Am I even spiritually alive? Were some of the questions we asked. So this week we'll start with really digging down into asking these questions that help you evaluate how spiritually healthy you are. So the first question, this question of do you enjoy God above everything else? Is he your ultimate joy? This is one that will sit at the background of all of the questions we're asking, because if you don't have a true enjoyment of God, none of these other questions are going to really matter to you, because why would they? If you don't truly enjoy God, why would you care about reading His Word? Why would you want to fellowship with other Christians? What common bond would you have with other Christians if you don't enjoy God? Why would you want to love others in the way that the Bible tells us that we love others? Because the Bible doesn't just preach a blind love of others. It preaches a love for others because of an enjoyment of God, a recognition of what Jesus did, a desire for God, an enjoyment of God above everything else will drive the rest of your spiritual life. So, my main focus in the few minutes we have today is going to be a verse that is pretty familiar to you. This is in Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, where Paul says, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Now, this is a fascinating verse. It's probably a familiar verse to you if you've been around Christianity for any period of time. Um, and this could certainly be a life-changing verse. It encompasses life and death, which is all of what we experience, right? So, to live is Christ, to die is gain. This is a kind of a cause and effect statement. So, this tells us that to live is one thing and to die is another thing. So, the question that I'll be addressing today is, what do you live for? How do you fill in that blank? Because notice that Paul says, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." This is a personal resolve that Paul is making. This is a conclusion that he's come to. And I love this verse because it kind of jumps right to the point and says that, hey, if something is worth living for, then it also has to be worth dying for. So if you say that to live is money, financial gain, then to die is to have no money, to be broke. If you say that to live is status, recognition in this world, then, well, to die is to be looked down upon or forgotten. If to live is sexual pleasure, then to die is a lack of pleasure. If to live is family and friends, then to die is losing your family or your friends leaving or passing away. The question here is, how do you fill in this blank? What is to live for you? Before we dive a little deeper into this passage, I'm just going to give a quick background of what's going on here in Philippians. Remember, this is a letter. This is a letter that's written to the church at Philippi. And this letter, Paul kind of opens with an update about how the gospel has been advanced despite him being put in prison. And even because of him being put in prison, he says the gospel has gone forward because of my suffering. And then, so I'm going to read the quick passage before we get to this passage on to live as Christ, to die as gain. Paul says, "Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not at all be ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death." So in this short passage, Paul's kind of giving a couple different ways in which Christians should seek to honor Christ in all that they do. He tells them to rejoice no matter what the circumstances. Despite his imprisonment, he's rejoicing. He talks about a full reliance on Christ there in verse 19, and that comes through the prayers of the church at Philippi who's praying for him. And he also talks about, and this is what transitions into this to live as Christ, to die as gain. He talks about how he honors Christ in representing Christ. His face is absolutely set on honoring Christ in his body, which he says whether by life or by death. And this brings us to verse 21. Because this is the driving force behind what he's saying before. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So, in these two ways that Paul is set on honoring Christ in his body. He's saying, if I live, it's for Christ, and if I die, it's for gain. So, this idea of to live is Christ. What does that even mean? If we go down to verse 22 after this, we kind of see a fuller explanation of this. Paul says, if I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. And what is fruitful labor for Paul? Well, in verse 25, he says, convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. So this brings us back around to the question that we're asking today of, do you enjoy Christ above all else? And that's what Paul is saying. His purpose here is in life. When he says to live is Christ, his purpose while he's here on earth, his fruitful labor, as he calls it, is seeing others progress in the faith, and more specifically, progress in their joy in the faith. So the entire purpose of Paul's life is that other people are making much of Jesus by being joyful in Jesus and boasting in Jesus. This is what to live is Christ means. So in basic terms, to live is Christ means we treasure Jesus above all else, and we make it the aim of our lives to see him enjoyed and treasured by the entire world. And the second half of this verse, to die is gain. Paul is saying here that while I'm here on earth, my purpose is to enjoy Christ and be an outward expression of that joy to others. And death is gain because it is to be with Christ. Death is gain because we're finally with Jesus. Death is gain because suffering will be removed and fellowship with Christ will be eternal. But Paul then, after this verse, which we just read, reasons that his calling now is to glorify Christ here in life, resting in the fact that, well, the worst that can happen to him is death, in which he gains Jesus. So, one pushback that's often given to joy in God being the driver of your Christian life is the accusation that this is a selfish motivation. After all, if your own personal enjoyment is what's driving you to serve God, aren't you just kind of seeking out your own pleasure? Shouldn't we just obey God because he's God, is a question that's often levied at this idea. Well, that's true in a way. We should seek after and obey God just because of who he is. But let me give you a quick example to help kind of make this point. So imagine that you had just spent the day with someone you care deeply about, whether that's a friend, a family member, a significant other, whoever you want to kind of, whatever comes into your mind when you think of someone that you care a lot for and spend a lot of time with. Imagine you've just kind of spent the day with them, hanging out, doing whatever you might do. And at the end of the day, you look at them and say, hey, I really enjoyed spending time with you today. Now, what does that person do? Do they kind of look at you and say, like, are you serious? Like, well, why is everything about you? Or are they honored? Do they feel good that that you said, hey, I enjoyed time with you today. Maybe they even look at you and say something like, hey, I enjoyed spending time with you today too. You see, one of the greatest honors we can give God is enjoying Him fully. In the same way, you're honored by someone saying, hey, I enjoyed time with you today. This is one of the greatest ways that we can honor God. And this concept is hard for people who live out their faith like a checklist, because there's no checklist for joy. It simply can't be forced. It has to come from a heart change that's brought about by the Spirit. So if you're kind of hearing all this and you're saying, yeah, I know I should enjoy God, like I understand that concept, but I just don't. I'm a Christian. I believe this. I trust that Jesus died on the cross for me. I get all that, but I'm not overwhelmed with joy when I think about going to God in prayer and reading scripture and fellowshipping with other believers. If you find yourself there, if you're struggling to truly enjoy God, the only solution is to pray, to ask God to fill you with the joy that only He can provide, and ask Him to reveal areas where your joy might be in the wrong place. So I hope that's helpful to you today. I hope the discussion goes well with your group, that you can kind of work through these things. And if you find yourself in that situation where you're struggling to answer this question, man, do I really enjoy God above all else? Ask others in your pod to pray for you in that. That's exactly when we look back to Paul in Philippians chapter 1, where we were talking about. He says, yes, I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and with the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. So Paul was relying on the prayers of his fellow believers, and I'd encourage you to do that today too if you find yourself struggling in this area.